sects, Gnostic beliefs tend to separate the universe into two categories. And one of these is associated with God. It's eternal, it's good, it's associated with light, and it's divine. And the other category is in some way bad, right? And we saw this with the followers of Simon Magus, how the universe is separated into good, and then also this useless, bad earthy stuff. The world tends to be a prison, and the good for humanity is to escape from the world, which people do by having the right knowledge, by having the right gnosis, which is where the word Gnosticism comes from. In the case of the Simonians, the followers of Simon Magus, this knowledge was believing in Simon, right? But there are more complicated versions of it that come up later. The Gnostic sects typically claim that there's some amount of the divine eternal goodness in humanity, and it's trapped in this prison. And you may sometimes hear of Gnosticism spoken of as Gnostic dualism, because of the way that it divides the universe into two. Other binary divisions, especially male and female, tend to also play into Gnostic understandings of the universe. You may have noticed that I'm saying things like Gnostics tend to believe this, or Gnostics often claim that. And the reason is because Gnosticism isn't one distinct thing. It's more of a category. It's a set of shared features that a bunch of different groups espoused, and we see relationships between them. So some people would object to the followers of Simon Magus being called Gnostics because they didn't actually call themselves Gnostics, whereas other sects did. But they share a lot of these features that we'll see later with other Gnostic groups. And this brings us to another figure, and this really is a Christian heresy, and it's one that shares a lot of the features of Gnosticism, certainly is a type of dualism, and that is Marcionism. So there's a slide that says Marcion, I think. It brings us to, oh, I thought I had a picture of Marcion. Maybe I don't. There we do. There we go. This is a picture of Marcion. The guy with no face is Marcion. It's an 11th century image. There aren't many. People tended not to really want to draw the heretics. So Marcion was born to the son of a bishop, the Bishop of Sinope in modern-day Turkey, in the late 1st or early 2nd century. And sometime around the year 130, he went to Rome. It's a bit unclear what happens at this point. It seems that he'd been in some sort of trouble with his father, possibly over an affair, or maybe this wasn't true because other sources don't say that this was, other sources seem to deny it. He seems to have offered a large financial gift to the church. And some say that he was a bishop when this happened. And then some sources say that he was accepted by the church in Rome, and some sources say that he wasn't. But it's clear that by the year 144, he had had a falling out with the church, and he was now he had founded in this year the Marcionite sect. Or we might say the Marcionite heresy. So Marcion's main concern, the thing that he was after, the thing that he taught, and the thing that people followed him in, was to separate Christianity from the God of the Old Testament. His view of the God of the Old Testament as a God who was rigidly just, as a God who punished the people, seemed incompatible to Marcion with the God of the New Testament. And so the way that he solved this, the way that Marcion decided to get past what he saw as this incompatibility between the way God is spoken about in the Old Testament and the way God is spoken about in the New Testament, was to say that we're in fact talking about two different gods. There's the good God of the New Testament, and the Old Testament God is a lesser type of God, a demiurge, who is responsible for creating the world, but isn't the supreme goodness that the God of the New Testament is. Now, this raised a couple of problems for Marcion. One is that the Gospels and the epistles that the church was reading at the time frequently affirmed and even frequently quoted the Old Testament. And we know, if we read the New Testament scriptures, that they take for granted that God the Father that they're talking about, the Father of Jesus Christ, is the God spoken of throughout the Old Testament. And so Marcion, one thing he did was he said we should not read the Old Testament as part of our religious texts. He considered it to be true, but about a different God. True about the demiurge, not true about the God of the New Testament. So get rid of the Old Testament. And the canon of the New Testament also wasn't fixed yet. So we have the canon of the New Testament wasn't fixed yet. So we have the 27 books of the New Testament that we consider the New Testament, but that hadn't been defined. There were a bunch of texts floating around, including all of the texts that we have now, but they weren't actually considered the scriptures. When people spoke about the scriptures, they were primarily talking about the Old Testament at this point when Marcion is around. And it's sort of in the process. The New Testament is in the process of being formed when this is happening. And so Marcion had a bit of freedom, as he believed, to decide which of these books were true and good and should be scripture, and which of these books should not. And he came up with his own canon. He's the first person, probably, at least the first person we have evidence about, who came up with a list saying these are the books of the New Testament. And that's the next slide, actually has that list that he came up with. And so you can see he had a version of the Gospel of Luke, but he cut a bunch of pieces out, or in the words of Tertullian, mutilated it. He also didn't say that it was the Gospel of St. Luke. And he also amended it. He didn't just cut parts out, but he changed things. So where we have verses like, I give thee thanks, Father, God of heaven and earth, Marcion changed it to, I give thanks, Father, Lord of heaven, cutting out earth, because earth was the creation of the demiurge. It's a different God. And where our text says, O foolish, has Christ say, O foolish and hard of heart, to believe in all that the prophets have spoken, he changes it to, O foolish and hard of heart, to believe all that I have told you. Because, of course, according to his system of belief, we shouldn't believe the prophets, right? So he came up with this canon of the New Testament, and as you can see, it's these 11 books versus the 27 that we have. Cut it all up, mutilated it so that it would reflect the things that he believed. And one of the influences, one of the places where he exerted an influence on the church by doing this is that it put pressure on other fathers of the church to begin defining the canon of the New Testament. There had already been some moves in that direction. It's believed that the epistles of Paul had already been collected and were already circulating at this time. But Marcion's effort kind of lit a fire under the people who were going to say, well, no, we actually need to define this as Holy Scripture. We actually need to make a book out of this and make sure that we know that you have to read this, right? That what it says in the epistle to the Hebrews is something that we look to for doctrine. We look to understand our faith. It's obviously not one of the books, not one of the epistles Marcion liked. And so the teaching of Marcion, this teaching of Marcion, also, because the physical world, the world of creation, was actually the realm of the demiurge, right? Not the good God of the New Testament. It was inappropriate in the mind of Marcion that Christ, the Son of the good God, should have anything to do with human flesh. And so Marcion's teaching involved an idea which is called Docetism. I have a slide with it just so you can see the word. And Docetism, oh, I had another thing about, one of the things that Marcion denied was the incarnation, right? So Christ wasn't fully human and fully divine. He starts his gospel, the Marcionite Gospel, with, in the 15th year of the Emperor Tiberius, God descended in Capernaum and taught on the Sabbaths. So he cuts out, he was using the Gospel of Luke, but he cuts out the birth and the infancy narrative and even Jesus being 12 years old. He just appears suddenly. Tertullian makes fun of him, says, suddenly a son, suddenly sent, suddenly Christ. And this teaching that Christ isn't actually human, but just appears to be human, is what's known as Docetism. And that is the next slide, which is just Seeming-ism. It's just from the Greek word for to seem. And so this is one of the ways that people taught the wrong thing about who Christ is, that he isn't actually a human being, he just seemed to be human. He's God, fully God in the teaching of Marcion, but not at all human. It's just an illusion, if you will. And Marcion and his followers further denied the resurrection of the body, of course, because the physical world is not redeemable, and the second coming of Christ. And this teaching, you can see, participates in this idea, this dualism. It's leaning in the direction of Gnosticism. Marcion himself probably isn't a Gnostic, but his followers certainly will. Later followers of Marcion, later Marcionites, divided the world into three principles: good, just, and evil, or good and just on the one hand and evil on the other. Some of his followers even went so far as to deny the resurrection of the soul, not just the body, but to say that some third thing is resurrected, not even the soul. Another one of his followers who branched off on his own and developed a following is a man named Apelles. And he taught that the demiurge is a creature. The God of the Old Testament was somehow created by the God of the New Testament. And this all sounds pretty wild. But Marcionism actually enjoyed widespread popularity. They had an organization that was very similar to that of the church. And they had their own buildings. Some 4th century sources, particularly in the East, even contain the suggestion that some people would have viewed that the Marcions seemed to have a claim on the term Christian. They were so popular a sect that the world was effectively divided into two different kinds of Christians, right? The Orthodox Christians and the Marcionites. And it wasn't actually clear who was going to sort of win out in that. Marcionism declined when Orthodox Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. And this is when it declined in the West. Now, there were other sects in existence at the same time that were fully Gnostic, like Valentius. And you see people come up with these diagrams of Gnosticism because it's all incredibly complicated. It involves incarnate ideas, not incarnate ideas. It involves eternal ideas that have a type of life, much like with Marcion, where there's a good God who is utterly separated from the world. These Gnostic ideas tend to have these eternal ideas existing in pairs, and the world comes about through some sort of sin or some sort of fault in one of these pairs. I won't try to interpret this for you because it's all too complicated. I'm not sure that I actually understand it. But the point of all this is that the world is effectively an error. And these very complicated systems involving ranks of different ideas and ranks of different creatures pop up. Usually they cast Christ as a figure who's come to liberate the eternal from the world, and they are generally ascribed to Docetism. They generally, where Christ is involved, they tend to view him as a god descended from the upper realm, but not actually participating in the physical world. So I was going to talk a little bit next about Manichaeism. I'm going to cut down what I was going to say because I see that I only have 15 minutes left. But Manichaeism isn't actually properly a Christian heresy. Manichaeism is a dualist Gnostic religion that was an attempt to combine all the existing religions. And they sort of flourished and spread throughout the world. They flourished and spread throughout the world in the 3rd century. And this is a Chinese painting of the Manichaean heaven from the 13th century. They're a very complicated dualist religion that's based in Zoroastrianism and Babylonian religion. And they were wildly popular. And you may have heard of Manichaeism because Augustine of Hippo belonged to them before he converted to Christianity. So this is one of the reasons they're interesting. The other reason they're interesting is because they influenced some really wild sects that were very popular in the Middle Ages. And they share a lot of these features of Gnosticism. They only bring in a couple of Christian ideas in a very superficial way. But they also have ideas about salvation coming not just through having the right ideas, but coming through separating oneself from the world now in this life. They have this idea of the elect or the perfect, who don't do anything physical as much as is possible. They don't eat meat or drink wine or own property or participate in business or anything like that. And this influences some sects later on. So Augustine of Hippo was one of them, but he converted and wrote a number of works against them. But we can skip over most of this. And so where these ideas, specifically Marcionism, right, and the heresies that existed in the early years of the church, influenced the church, is that they asserted things about God and about the scriptures that were untrue and forced the church to clarify this, right? Just as Marcion had induced the church to clarify what are the New Testament scriptures, other things that people were teaching about who Jesus is made the church clarify who he is. So about the same time that the Marcionites were rejecting the humanity of Christ, there was another group that was going around rejecting the divinity of Christ. And these were known as the Ebionites. Now, we're not really sure where the name comes from. It may be that there was a man named Ebion that they followed. It may be that it's from an Aramean word meaning poor men. But in any case, unlike the Marcions, these were a group of people who were very attached to the Old Testament scriptures. They actually considered themselves to be Jewish Christians, and that they considered their duty to be to follow the law, to continue to follow the law. They also denied the virgin birth, but they also denied that Christ was actually divine. They espoused an idea known as adoptionism, which is they affirmed that Jesus was fully a human being, but he was only adopted as the Son of God. Through his perfect obedience, he earned the ability to be the Savior. And so he wasn't actually God. Another very influential wrong belief about the nature of Christ then is Arianism. And that is the next slide. And this is after Arius, a 3rd century priest who taught that the Son didn't share the same nature as the Father. He was effectively another person who was denying the divinity of Jesus Christ. Now, a big problem for Arianism, denying that Jesus coexists, another problem for Arianism, denying that the Son, the second person of the Trinity, exists in the same way that the Father, the first person of the Trinity, exists, is the beginning of the Gospel of John, which is on the next slide. The first 3 verses read, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made." So this is the beginning of the Gospel of John, and the people following Arius, and Arius himself, had to deal with this text, right, in order to deny that the Son exists from the very beginning. The beginning of the Gospel of John states it very clearly. The way they dealt with this was they claimed that the Word is not the same thing as the Son. The Word is an attribute of God the Father, and God the Son was created. There was a point in time when he didn't exist, and then he came into existence. And so he was not equal in dignity. And just like Marcion's attempts to create his own New Testament influenced the church to define what the New Testament actually is, it was largely the Arian heresy and the fact that it was very popular that influenced the church to meet and define what it actually believed about who Christ is. So Arius existed in the Diocese of Alexandria, and the bishop of Alexandria was given the duty of putting down this heresy, of making sure that people didn't follow his teachings and come to believe that Jesus Christ was not divine and not equal in dignity to the Father. He was denounced in an earlier council, but it didn't work. His teaching continued to spread, and so they appealed to the emperor. Basically, the appeals annoyed Constantine into calling the First Ecumenical Council, and he called the Council of Nicaea in 325. And even bishops from outside the Roman Empire attended. Eusebius tells us that more than 250 bishops were present, whereas Athanasius says in one of his writings that it was 300 and another that it was 318. The debate about whether or not Arius was right was apparently very heated. And the hagiography of St. Nicholas of Smyrna, who is the origin of Santa Claus, even tells us that it got so heated that St. Nicholas slapped Arius, which is what the image was before. It was St. Nicholas slapping Arius from an Eastern painting. But this probably didn't happen. The hagiography is much later, and it's dubious because none of the other sources record that this slap actually happened. But it was a very heated debate. And the result of this council was that the church came together to create a creed. They came together to create a statement of what the church believes. And the next slide has for you a translation of the creed that came out of that council. Now, I didn't actually call this the Nicene Creed. We have a creed that we call the Nicene Creed, which takes this as its starting point. But it actually doesn't include, the one that we say now, doesn't actually include the last part. It actually has a different last part that was added later. But you see how they are asserting the things that we believe, and they're asserting the things that we believe specifically in contradiction of the heresies that were floating around. The part we can see at the end is directly addressed to Arius and his followers. Those who say there was a time when he was not, and he was not before he was begotten, and that he was made out of nothing, or who maintain that he is of another hypostasis, right, another nature or another substance than the Father, or that the Son of God is created or mutable, meaning he can change or subject to change. I'm sorry, I have to move you guys around because I can't actually see this. The Catholic Church anathematizes. So this is actually where the Nicene Creed comes from. It's shaped, these heresies, these attempts to figure out who Jesus was that went against the teaching of the church, led to the creation of the creeds. They led to the creation of the New Testament canon that we have today. Now, the last clause of the Nicene Creed that we have now was added later, possibly at the Council of Constantinople in 381, although it's not actually attested. We don't actually have it written down until the records of Chalcedon in 451. And it seems like there are bishops at this council who haven't heard of it before. So it's a later edition. There were opponents of Arius who also came up with solutions to who Christ is, who came up with ways of countering Arius arguments that also veered off into other different errors. One of these is Apollinaris, who tried to solve the issue by teaching that Christ had a human body, and even part of his soul was human, but the rational part of his soul, the thinking part of his soul, was actually divine, was actually the divine word. And the reason they came up with this is because Apollinaris viewed that the rational soul was liable to sin, and so it didn't make sense that Christ, who was without sin, could have one. So they took out that part of his soul and replaced it. But this heresy was condemned by the Pope. Said, no, that's not true. Other approaches to solving this question of Christ's nature, defining who Christ was, came up with the idea that he in fact has one nature. There's a version of this that says he has a human nature and he has a divine nature, but the divine nature basically takes over the human nature. And so it becomes something else. It's just one. It's not two natures in one person, but it's just one thing, and it's something new. But a little earlier than this, there's this very interesting case of Nestorius. So Nestorius was born in Syria and lived in the late 4th and early 5th century. We don't know the date of his birth, but we know that he died in 451. He was a priest and monk who was chosen to be the patriarch, to be the bishop of Constantinople. And he made it his mission to get rid of heresies. Arianism was still flourishing. A number of other heresies were still flourishing. People were believing all kinds of wrong things. And Nestorius saw it as his mission to get rid of these so that people would believe the right thing. But within a year of his consecration, he got into trouble in trying to do exactly this. He preached a sermon against the use of the word Theotokos, against the use of the word God-bearer, which is an epithet that gets applied to the Virgin Mary. It's like we might say Mary, Mother of God, right? So she's the one who bore God in her body. Now, Nestorius was concerned with teaching against the later Arians, the later followers of Arius, who departed from Arius' own teaching. They were teaching that Christ had a divine soul that, they were teaching that he was not divine. And the Apollinarians were teaching about the divine word that took on a place of his soul. And Nestorius taught what he had received, which is that Christ's humanity was complete and his divinity was complete, and they were linked. But he objected to the idea that God was formed in a human womb. And so in this sermon, he talks about how he doesn't like the word Theotokos, he doesn't like the word God-bearer, except in as much as the humanity of Christ and the divinity of Christ are linked in an inseparable way. And so only in that sense can we really call Mary the Mother of God. He objects to the idea that God, who's uncreated, can be created in a human womb. And so he talks about God assuming a human man. Now, what Nestorius' opponents accused him of saying was that Christ, rather than being one person with two natures, which is what the church teaches now, was actually two persons. Though Nestorius went on to deny that that's what he was actually teaching. He said he was not teaching about two Christs. He was not teaching about two sons. And he insists that Theotokos is an acceptable term if it's understood correctly. But others took up his writings and accused him of being just like the Ebionites. They accused him of saying that he was a human man who was only adopted as the Son of God, which doesn't actually seem to be what Nestorius was actually teaching. This is complicated by the fact that he had a rival in the Patriarch of Alexandria, the Bishop of Alexandria, St. Cyril, who took it upon himself to get rid of Nestorius. He wrote a 5-book work against Nestorius' teachings, and he sent these to the Pope, expecting the Pope just to say, no, this is wrong. But instead, what the Pope did was he made it Cyril's job to excommunicate Nestorius. So Cyril came up with a bunch of statements that Nestorius had to say were untrue, things that Cyril was saying he said that he had to say was untrue. Within 10 days, he got these statements, and instead of simply signing on to them, Nestorius appealed to the emperor to call a council. So they called a council to decide this matter. Now they decided for Cyril. They decided against Nestorius, but they decided before all the bishops had arrived. So what then happened was the other bishops who were late to the council arrived, were super annoyed that they hadn't been a part of this decision, called their own council, and excommunicated Cyril instead. So now we have 2 different councils of bishops each saying that one of them is wrong, each trying to get rid of both of them. And this annoyed the emperor. So he said, okay, you both go. He excommunicated them both. Now Cyril came back, and Nestorius didn't. Nestorius seems to have won out in the end, so that even the bishops who supported him were all deposed, and he himself was not officially exiled, but basically fled to Egypt and lived out his days there, although occasionally being attacked. And I see that it is now 20 after 8. So I'm going to wrap up with Nestorius. But those are the major thrusts of the Christological heresies. There are only so many things you can say that are wrong about Christ. One is that he's not divine. One is that he's not human. One is that he's both, but they're not contained within the same person, right? His human and divine natures are, he's 2 different people. Anyway, I will take questions now.